Hello, Ames Chamber of Commerce members. This is Drew Camp, Vice President here at the Ames Chamber of Commerce, here for our June 12th, it sounds crazy to say that, weekly legislative update. I want to start off with some state issues, and then I'll touch on some federal issues for policy pieces as well. There's a lot more state issues because they're really trying to, hopefully by the end of this weekend, get out and adjourn sine die. So some of the issues I wanted to touch on is I'll start with the fact that the governor lifted capacity limits on businesses starting today at 8 a.m. Places like bars, theaters, restaurants could open up at 100% capacity, but they are expected to take reasonable measures to ensure social distancing is enforced and adequate cleaning is done to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So that's something we will continue to see with those establishments growing and expanding their offerings to their clientele. A few big items policy-wise that have passed in this last week. It was a very eventful week down at the legislature. As you know, they're in a delayed session now due to COVID-19. But the House passed a budget proposal that's the status quo to FY 2020, the current fiscal year levels for FY 2021, starting July 1st. And what that is a $7.8 billion general fund budget. A few highlights I wanted to touch on is it includes the already provided around $100 million for K-12 schools, as well as increases for children's health insurance and Medicaid and a few other programs. It does not contain any additional revenue for the expanded adult and children's mental health programs approved over the past 2 years. And it does not include money for workforce development, child care, or water quality priorities that the governor outlined in her $8 billion budget to start the session. I must note, however, as you heard me say in the headline, that was just the House's proposed budget. The Senate has some different priorities and some different thoughts. They have a little bit more secure majority going into the election, so they're seeing things from a different perspective. So that's something they'll have to come to agreement on before they can send a final budget to the governor. A few other items I wanted to touch on is that the Iowa Senate did pass a bill limiting the Secretary of State's power to issue absentee ballots. And what that would have done would prohibit the Secretary of State from automatically mailing absentee ballot request forms like they did for the primary. But the good news is the House last night passed the bill with some amendments without those limiting powers. And it passed on bipartisan lines. And what it would do is it would allow the Secretary of State to make specific requests to the legislature as needed to ensure adequate access, especially in rural areas where there may be limited polling places. That's kind of what I mean by that. But it is very important to note that once again, too, has to have agreement between the two chambers. The Senate obviously has drawn their line in the sand on one end. The House has drawn their line in the sand on the other. So we expect this might be a bargaining chip towards the end of the legislative session. So we'll have to wait and see next week what comes of this. But it's really important to note because there was record turnout in the primary. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and it's in a presidential election year where we expect record turnout. So if you're trying to limit absentee ballot requests and ability to vote, that's going to be something that's going to get a lot of attention. The Iowa Senate also passed a liability bill, and what that would do is the Senate and House passed a protection legislative package for businesses and individuals that would give businesses the certainty they need to reopen and hire Iowans without fear of litigation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's something that's headed to the governor, and we expect her to sign with bipartisan and support. The Iowa legislature also passed historic bipartisan police reform as well, justice reform. And that actually passed just late this week. And that's something that obviously, as we've seen throughout the country, the protest after the death of George Floyd, they really took up, and it's passed with very, very much bipartisan support. The governor actually went on both floors as they debated it as really a show of the importance of the issue and how it's a needed reform and a needed change here in our state to provide the certainty that we need in our justice system. Just a few pieces to touch on that the bill included. It revoked law enforcement certifications for officers who were fired or resigned due to serious misconduct while working. It also prohibits officers from out of state who were charged with serious misconduct from receiving certification in Iowa. It bans the use of chokeholds unless officers believe their lives are legitimately at risk. It grants the Iowa Attorney General's office the power to investigate and prosecute an officer who committed a criminal offense that leads to someone's death. and it requires all law enforcement agencies to provide annual implicit bias and de-escalation training. This was something that I think everyone was pretty happy to see pass. It was something that they had talked about for a long time. The governor had talked about wanting to do some criminal justice reform, and this falls right in that line. So we were happy to see this move forward and see this bill passed with the bipartisan support it needed, and it will be a good thing for the state going forward. A few other items I wanted to touch on is the tax bill. GILTI, which and some things that it includes, I should say, are GILTI, which is a tax on foreign income. It passed both the House and the Senate, it passed the House 90-5, and the Senate has not debated it yet, but there is bipartisan support for that piece. There is also a provision to start a new Reinvest in Iowa at $100 million with the requested changes that IADA had put in. And what that is it's essentially a sales tax increment financing package to allow you to use for large projects. So think things along the lines of the Hilton Hotel project in downtown Des Moines. That received some of the original reinvestment tax credit or Iowa Reinvestment Act funds. So this would provide some additional funds to Iowa Economic Development Authority to put towards large placemaking projects. It's something we are very much in favor of. They did also do some technical corrections to fix 5 years worth of changes that were needed at the Iowa Department of Revenue. Port authorities were included in the House version, but not in the Senate, and that really allows you to combine different entities together for economic development and placemaking and community development projects. And finally, it was something very important here at the Ames Chamber with Ames Seed Capital Fund, is the angel investor tax credit is included in the Senate tax bill, but not in the House. There is conversations to have it included in a different way in the House, but we'll wait and see how that plays out. Future Ready Iowa, which is the governor's workforce development initiative, one of her priority bills every year now since it got passed a few years ago, that's passed both, and we don't expect any issue with that moving forward. Empower Rural Iowa to improve the broadband expansion program throughout the state, that passed. And the universal licensing bill, it needs some help in the House Republican caucus. What it really does is it allows us to help promote Iowa as an opportunity in hard to fill positions that need certification. So it would allow you to transfer those certifications within reason. Some certain fields that have some more stringent requirements would not be allowed to simply have universal licensing. But it's a workforce issue really, so that's something we're going to be pushing forward to try to get passed before the session adjourns here, most likely this weekend as well. A few federal issues that I wanted to touch on as well are the Federal Reserve did make some updates to the Main Street lending program, which obviously is a Main Street community we obviously keep track of. Some of the changes that they made there was fivefold. It lowered the minimum loan size for certain loans from $250,000 from $500,000 and increased the maximum loan size for all facilities. It increased the terms of each loan option from 5 years to 4 years, and how that was done is it extended the repayment period for all loans by delaying principal payments for 2 years rather than one, which was in the original proposal. And finally, it raised the Reserve Bank's participation to 95% for all loans. We think this will be more inclusive for Main Street entities and small businesses that may be looking at that lending program, and we're happy to see that move forward. It has not formally been enacted and made available yet, but it's something we continue to monitor and make sure that people know what's going on with it. So once it is available, they are ready to execute it. And then the final thing I want to touch on is the Small Business Administration did release an interim rule for revisions to the Paycheck Protection Loan Program. You hear me talk about that pretty much every week now. But what that did is it really updated it to the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, which is what I had talked about, the changes being made to extend the period out and things along those lines that I touched on last week. So you can take a look at the link that'll be provided in the body of the email and get some more information on that. So with that, I will kind of wrap up. Next week should be a pretty eventful update as well, because we do expect the legislature down in Des Moines to have adjourned by then, and there'll be a lot of issues to go through and talk through at that point. So do please come back next week and watch this update and get updated on all the state and federal issues that may be happening. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good weekend.